Welcome everyone to the Community IT Innovators webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about BYOD for nonprofits, and Johan Hammerstrom, who's the COO of Community IT Innovators, is going to be presenting today. Just a few tips before we get started. We encourage you to ask questions. We want to make this as interactive as possible. We'll also be sharing a few polls during the webinar, so please respond to those as well. And if possible, avoid multitasking. And we will be recording the webinar, so the PowerPoint and the recording will be sent to you afterwards. Just a little bit about Community IT Innovators. We're based in Washington, D.C., and we help nonprofits address their strategic and day-to-day IT challenges. And I'm going to hand it over to Johan.
Hello, everybody. We're really glad you could join us today for this webinar. This is a topic that I know I've been interested in for a long time, and I think it's something that I've heard a lot of questions about, and I'm just really looking forward to kind of going through this with you today. We're going to have a number of polls during the presentation, and we really look forward to getting feedback from all of you who are out there listening. And also there'll be a couple of times where we just want to kind of solicit your feedback and just get some input from everyone attending the webinar today about sort of your experience with BYOD. So the agenda today, I'm going to go through a brief history of BYOD to kind of set the stage for how we've gotten where we are with this challenge of bring your own device. Then I'm going to discuss some of the best practices that we've encountered for dealing with BYOD in your organization. And then we'll talk a little bit about risk management. I think one of the big concerns, and rightly so, that a lot of people have with bring your own device is that it can lead to risks for the organization. And a lot of people are wondering, how do I manage those risks? That's something that we're going to address towards the end of the webinar. And then finally, we're going to have some sort of concrete how-to tips on what you can do to get started on creating your own BYOD policy for your organization. And I don't think that that's going to be a 6 or 7 month process involving lots of people and leading to a 20-page document. Sometimes the best BYOD policies, even in very large organizations, are the simplest ones, that may be 1 or 2 pages long. So that's really the goal here, is to really provide all of you listening today with more of a framework for how to think about BYOD, and then some concrete tools and tips for for how to work with it and manage it well within your organization. Before we get started on that, we had a couple questions for you. So we're going to launch the first poll right now, and we just want to get a sense of the size of organizations that our listeners are part of. So if you could just respond to that question, that would be great. Oh, right. Excellent. Well, we've got it's pretty evenly split between the 4 different size categories. So we have a nice sort of even distribution of sizes. And I think one thing that you'll find is that often, in many ways, BYOD problems are as much the function of the size of the organization as they are, what the organization does and how it works. So I think everyone here in the different size organizations is going to find something useful. So we'll go ahead and close that poll. We can share that with you all. So there you can see we got a nice variety of listeners out there, which is great. And we're happy to have all of you with us this afternoon. The second question we want to ask is, how well do you feel your organization is managing BYOD right now? How well are you managing it? So we'll go ahead and launch that. You can just take a quick second and answer that. Your results are anonymous, so answer honestly. You don't need to. All right, great. We've got one organization, it looks like, with a BYOD policy, another one that's just starting out with BYOD. Hasn't started yet. Over half are just starting out, and maybe a third feel like they're managing it a bit. Great. Well, this is I think this webinar is going to be very helpful for most of you. That's certainly our intention. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So real quick, brief history. It's going to be very brief, very visual history of BYOD, how we got to where we are now. So computers used to be big. And, back in the 50s, 60s, and even into the 1970s, a typical computer in an organization looked something like this. People didn't have computers in their homes, and in general, most workers in organizations and businesses didn't even have computers on their desks. The computer was something in another part of the office, if they were large enough, where you go to get data processed. Computers also used to be very expensive. So even as they got smaller going into the 70s, computers represented, a single computer was a huge investment for an organization. So that figure, under 18,000, which even by today's standards, seems, exorbitant for most organizations. Factoring in for inflation and the increasing value over time, you could see that computers were very expensive. But in the late 70s, something started to change. Computers started getting smaller. And, the Apple II wasn't the only one. There were others, but Apple was certainly kind of at the forefront of the personal computer revolution, which really allowed people to not only have computers on their desks, and so you started to see in organizations more and more staff using computers, but people now were able to have computers at home. And the personal computer revolution really was the beginning of a process in which computer technology started to become used by more and more people. And of course, computers got a little bit more friendly. So you can see here in the difference between these IBM PC ads from the 80s and the previous ad with the very serious business person with his very expensive computer. People's attitudes towards technology, started to change back in the 80s. And I'm going to fast forward now, because this is all ancient history, to today, where computers are really ubiquitous. And so if you look at in this office, and this is a photo from the Georgetown newspaper, you see that there's computers everywhere. And this is not true just of college newspapers, but also most organizations will have workstations. You can see the student there. He's got his laptop, and he's doing something on his cell phone. Someone in the back has a tablet. Computers are everywhere these days. And in addition to being everywhere, they've also become very personal. And so instead of the computer being something that is in another room in a different part of the organization, it's something that you carry around with you. And this is really a function of how much the technology has changed and advanced. So we want to do another quick poll here. We want to ask you all, do any of you, and again, these are anonymous, so you can answer honestly, do any of you use your own personal device for doing work? All right, so we've got about 80%. We'll go ahead and close that poll and share the results with you. As you can see, about 2/3 are using a personal device some of the time. 1/3 use their personal devices all of the time for doing their work, and one person never uses their personal device for work. And that, I think, is pretty typical of where we are now. In general, personal devices are in the workplace, and I think they're not leaving. And so the question for those of us who are responsible for IT becomes, well, how are we going to deal with that reality? How are we going to manage that? One kind of way of describing this, or one catch-all term that I often use to describe this, is consumerization. And I did a whole blog series on our blog on the future of IT that really kind of went into some greater detail about the degree to which consumerization has really changed the nature of IT and technology for organizations. And if you're interested in learning more about that, you can check out that blog series. It's got some links to articles that I've found very helpful in thinking about this challenge and this change. So the question becomes, what are some best practices out there. That what are some industry best practices for dealing with consumerization and bring your own device issues? So unfortunately, that was a bit of a red herring. There are actually no best practices right now in the industry for dealing with BYOD, in the sense that there's no consistent approach. There are some best practices depending on the approach that you want to take, but there's no one who's going to be able to tell you, well, this is the approach that everybody should be taking. And there's no better place really to look at that than two of the largest companies in the world, Shell, the oil company, and IBM, the technology consulting firm. These are, like I said, two large, old, well-established companies, and they have developed remarkably divergent approaches to BYOD. How so? Well, let's start by talking about Shell. Shell just recently announced, a couple months ago, that it was going to take a very aggressive approach to dealing with BYOD. What I mean by that is that they had a goal of getting 90% of their workforce of 150,000 employees and consultants to use their own devices within the next 5 years. So that's a huge number of their staff who will no longer be using company-provided devices, but rather using their own personal devices to do their work. And so that's a very aggressive approach to BYOD. In fact, that's going beyond BYOD. It's instead of saying, well, you have the option to use your own machine and your own device, it's really requiring that employees use their own device in order to get their work done. How are they going to do this? Well, what Shell decided to do was build, because they're a very large company, they had the ability to build their own cloud-based two-factor authentication system that would support a wide variety of devices. And what's really interesting is that they went to Computer Associates, one of the largest computer companies in the world right now, and said, well, we want to have a really aggressive BYOD policy, and we need to, do you have a system that you can sell us that would allow us to sort of secure our information but still allow access to it for all of our employees who are going to be using their own devices? And tellingly, Computer Associates did not actually have a solution ready to go. That's how new this problem is. They did have a solution that they were working on developing called CloudMinder, and they signed a contract with Shell to customize it for Shell's needs. So Shell is really at the forefront of this change, along with a few other companies. Why did Shell make that decision? And I think the reasons why they made this decision are also really important to consider. And basically, the quote from Ken Mann, who's Shell's enterprise information security architect, said, in about 5 to 10 years, 50% of our staff worldwide will retire. We're going to have a lot of people turning over, and we want to be able to attract and retain talented and young staff. They don't want to come into a locked corporate environment. So really, it's a really interesting reason for why they adopted this strategy. And basically, they looked at the kind of staff they would need to attract and hire over the next 5 to 10 years. And they said they're going to want BYOD, and that's why we need to pursue this. Now, that may not be the right decision for every organization, and you shouldn't take that and assume that it's
So one of the questions that came in is, who supports the equipment that the individuals are using? Did Shell indicate, well, do they have an IT provider? Or?
No, that's a great question, and they have not yet. The details of the plan have not been released yet. And that's a good question that we'll actually address that a little bit later on in the webinar. So anyway, I don't want you all to think that, well, if Shell's doing that, that's the right thing to do, because you need to look no further than IBM to see that they're really going in the opposite direction. IBM is pursuing what I would call a conservative BYOD strategy, where right now 20% of their staff use their own device, but they've decided to actually reduce that number. So the reason is that IBM was very concerned about data leaking out of the organization, and also about security threats to the organization through third-party means. And the number one issue they had was with Dropbox, and I'll talk about that in a second. But in order to increase the security of the network, what IBM did was basically block any third-party file sync utilities. That includes iCloud. And so those of you who have an iPhone or an iPad know that iCloud is what you need to synchronize, do over-the-air backups of your device. iCloud is what's used to synchronize contacts. If you're using Apple's email system, the iCloud sync is responsible for that. And so basically IBM said, well, if you want to use your iPhone to access work information, that's fine, but you can't use iCloud. And at that point, you have to wonder how many of the employees actually want to continue to use their personal device to access the network if they're not even going to be able to use something basic like iCloud. The main reason was the security concerns, and there was a great article by a penetration tester, a digital forensic science named Jacob Williams, and he was basically hired by a company to find any holes in their corporate security, in their information security. And so he tried to hack into the firewalls. He tried other ways of social engineering. None of them worked. The network was fairly secure. And then he discovered that the CIO was using Dropbox, a personal Dropbox account, to work on files at the office and then go home and work on the files at night from his home. And so basically, sparing you some of the gory details, although we have a link to this article if you're interested in finding out more, he basically built his own piece of malware that he was able to load into the CIO's Dropbox account, and within a day or two, he had access to the entire network. And he called it Drop Smack. That was the name of the application, the malware that he wrote. So that, if you're an organization or a corporation that is being targeted, or that, someone who's got the time and effort to go after you, would spend the time to do so, Dropbox could be a threat to you. And I think this is one of the things that really concerned IBM, and one of the reasons that they adopted a more conservative BYOD posture. So even though there's no sort of industry standard single best practice for dealing with BYOD, there are a number of guidelines that I think are important for you all to keep in mind as you're thinking about BYOD for your own organization. And I think one of the take-home messages really in comparing these two different examples of IBM and Shell is that, BYOD is something that really needs to align with your organization, with how your organization works, the kind of work that you do, your company culture, and your overall organizational strategy. And obviously, I'm not going to be able to go through every possible permutation of those different factors. But what I want to talk about next are some general guidelines that hopefully you'll be able to apply to your own unique situation, and will help you to come up with a BYOD sort of approach and policy. So I think the place to really start is risk. I think one of the central thing to be managed in BYOD is risk, and how do you go about managing that risk. And actually the first thing, even before you start talking about the risk explicitly, is the benefit. What are the benefits that you're hoping to get from BYOD? And I've come up with a list of 4 different benefits that I think sort of capture most of the reasons that organizations would want to allow or pursue a BYOD policy. This comes up a lot. Organizations want to reduce hardware and support costs. And so the idea is that if you go with a BYOD approach and you ask employees to use their own mobile devices, or even, as becoming more common, bring their own computers from home, then that reduces the amount of money that an organization has to spend on the hardware and support of that hardware. Now that's not always the case, because oftentimes organizations will trade the direct purchase of hardware and support of it with a stipend that employees can use to purchase their own hardware. And we'll talk a little bit more about the pros and cons of that approach in a few minutes. But certainly reducing costs is something that's on everyone's mind all the time, and is often something that's considered when looking at a BYOD policy. Work flexibility, I think, is another key one. And this is largely due to the ability that we now all have to work from a variety of locations, whether it's from a coffee shop, whether it's from our home at night, or as is becoming more common, whether it's employees that are in a different part of the country. I think increasingly we've found that most of our clients usually have at least one employee who's a full-time employee of the organization and working in a different city. And so just the work flexibility, the ability to pick when and how and where you want to work is one of the reasons that BYOD has become a lot more popular. Employee availability is another benefit. And it's maybe some people would say sort of the flip side or the dark side, if you will, to the work flexibility, and that is being available at all times. So even when you leave the office, if you have an office, you can, your boss or your coworkers can get a hold of you if they need you for something. And then finally, and I think this shouldn't be underestimated or discounted, BYOD, I think, can often lead to greater user adoption and satisfaction. When someone is allowed to use their own personal device, they tend to be more comfortable with it. They'll experiment with it more, they'll figure out how it works, and they're likely to be better at using it than they are with a company-provided device. And so this is another reason. It can lead to, greater morale, greater satisfaction, and greater productivity. So we're just curious if any of these benefits resonate with you. Do you think your organization would see the value in or is currently seeing the value in any of these benefits of BYOD? And you can answer as many as apply to you. All right, so so the biggest one is the work flexibility, and then user adoption and satisfaction, then employee availability, and then reducing costs, which is good. I think that's definitely the order that I would more or less place them in terms of where you're most likely to see the greatest benefits. I think reducing costs is something that people often think of as what they're going to get from BYOD, and that isn't always the case. That really depends on how well you approach it. All right. So these are the benefits. These are all the great things that will happen if you have a good BYOD policy in place. But what about the risks? Well, there's three main categories of risk that I like to think of when considering BYOD. The first is information security, and I'm going to go into each of these in more detail. The second is legal. There are legal risks that you face. And finally, there are financial risks. So we'll talk about the information security, legal, and financial risks that you already, since most of you are already using personal devices for work, these are risks that are already there for your organization. And when thinking about risks of BYOD, I actually like to think of it as two different sort of categories of risk. There's risk that the organization faces in allowing employees to use their own personal devices, and there are risks that the individual, the staff person faces in using their personal device for work. And there's some intersection of these risks, and I tend to think that in general, where those risks intersect are mostly morale issues. So most of the time, the risks or the downside that the individual is concerned about or worried about with BYOD ends up being morale issues, and you'll see more what I mean by that in a minute. So what are some of the information security risks? On the organization side, one of the big ones is data leakage. so the concern that data is going to leak out of the organization. So for example, those of you who have smartphones and you're checking your work email on the smartphone, if your phone gets lost, then suddenly whoever stole your phone or finds your phone has access to all of your work email. So that can be a big problem. But there are other, there's so many different ways now in which data can leave an organization. Dropbox being another common one that we talked about before. Evernote is a very popular utility. I use it all the time for taking notes, and the extent to which I have organizational data, stored in my Evernote account, that could be a way in which data can leak out of the organization. So that's a big concern, and that's definitely something that is really important to think about. But it can also be a vector into the company, and I want to explain what I mean by that in a little more detail. So the term vector is a biological term, and it's basically the means with which, generally a virus is transmitted in a population, and it's a term that's been adopted in the tech sector. And so the vector is basically the means with which a virus, a computer virus or a malware, is transmitted into an organization. And in the olden days, the most common vector was the 3.5-inch floppy disk, those old, hard floppy disks. That was really most of the antivirus programs were really focused on scanning those disks as soon as you put them into your computer, because that's how information traveled, pre-internet. And then when the internet, came around, the most common vector was email. And email viruses have really been, a huge problem for about 15 years. And I'll never forget the company that I used to work for, when we got hit with the I love you virus, it hit my pager account, and I was suddenly getting, like hundreds of pages, saying I love you from the I love you virus. And that was the beginning, really, in my experience of, the email virus. And a lot has been done over the last 15 years to really control the spread of viruses through email. And most organizations now use something like Postini or McAfee or Symantec to filter their email before it comes into the company. And in general, most people are pretty good now about not opening random attachments from strangers who they don't know. So email as a vector is no longer, it's no longer as effective as it used to be. And so in the eternal cat and mouse game with hackers, they've moved on to other forms of, either intruding into a network or injecting malware and viruses into a network. So I talked about Dropsmack earlier. So Dropbox is a way in which malware can enter your network that, for now at least, you don't have as much control over the way that you do with email if you're managing IT. But another one is Skype. And we actually had a client a couple months ago who uses Skype extensively. And a lot of organizations, especially organizations that work internationally, rely on Skype heavily to do their work. And one person in the organization got a Skype message from someone, and they didn't recognize who it was right away, but they went ahead and opened the file, and it ended up delivering a payload, this really nasty virus that ended up taking 3 or 4 days to clean up. So that's actually an interesting example because there's no BYOD actually involved in that example. It's just Skype, which people were using for work purposes. But it just kind of goes to show the extent to which all of these new softwares, devices, ways of communicating have led to new ways of, of basically delivering viruses and malware into an organization. So those are the key sort of information security risks at the organizational level. The personal information security risks are, number one, onerous security measures. And so that kind of goes back to the IBM example where, they basically locked down the devices so much that they were no longer really useful. And so there's this balance here between, the organization's need to, keep information from flowing out of the organization and the individuals need to have a device that is useful to them. I think the more common personal risk with regards to information security is loss of full control of the device. And because this is such a new area, there are a lot of, not a lot, there are some tools out there for managing devices, but what you're basically agreeing to do is let your company or your organization manage your personal device. And the most common approach right now is that if you connect to an Exchange server, Microsoft gives you the tools to be able to wipe the device if necessary, but that wiping of the device includes all personal data you might have on the device. And the common concern there is, the IT department thinks your device has been compromised, goes and wipes it, and suddenly all of your personal pictures are gone. So that's just one small example, but there's some personal concerns around, loss of full control of the device in a BYOD setting. So these are some of the information security risks that need to be taken into account. What about the legal risks? These are much less well known. And unfortunately right now, there's a real lack of certainty in both, certainly in legislation. There's really no legislation that's been passed, and most of the articles that I've read by lawyers on this topic don't think that there's anything coming anytime soon. And so they sort of, the basic feeling in the legal community, as far as I can tell, is that a lot of this is going to be worked out in case law, and we just have to wait for those cases to make their way through the legal system and sort of establish a variety of precedents around BYOD. There's plenty of cases being heard right now, but it's definitely, from a legal standpoint, still emerging. So, so we don't know yet. There's certainly compliance issues that some organizations need to be concerned with, particularly health care organizations. They have to comply with HIPAA regulations, need to make sure that their BYOD policy does not violate that compliance. But beyond that, beyond those compliance requirements, there's really not much there. What are some of the legal risks on the personal level? Well, the big one is that, basically, your personal device could be confiscated. One of the examples I read about was hypothetical, and it came from the tech industry, was, for example, let's say a salesperson is at a conference, they start taking pictures with their personal phone. The competitor sees them doing this, says, "Oh, you're taking pictures of our products. You're infringing, on our products," and then the phone that was being used to take the pictures could be confiscated. Or basically, anytime a personal device is implicated in a lawsuit, it could be confiscated and used as evidence. And so then you're without your personal device. And what does the organization do at that point? What if all of your photos are on that device? You have it set up in a certain way. That's a personal risk that individuals are taking when they're using their device for work-related reasons. And really, it just means that the personal kind of blur. There's a lack of clear boundary between the personal and, let's say, the corporate. So those are the legal risks. It seems a little thin because it is. The legal risks are not known nearly as well at this point as the information security risks. And financial risks. What are some of the financial risks? On the organization side, stipends can be more expensive than a single corporate plan. That really depends on the size of your organization, but oftentimes we'll hear or read about companies and organizations that have basically done away with a corporate plan and moved to a stipend system and find out that they're actually paying more and getting less, because instead of aggregating all of their plans and devices into a single corporate plan with a single carrier, they're now having to pay sort of an individual plan rate on a lot of different carriers. So it can be more expensive if you're going to provide full coverage. It can also mean that IT support becomes entangled in supporting personal devices. So your IT support service or IT support department They may be great at supporting iPhones, and if you're on a corporate plan with Verizon and everybody has iPhones, that's pretty easy for them to support. And if you switch to a BYOD approach where, people can have a Windows Mobile phone on Sprint and a new BlackBerry phone on AT&T and an Android phone on T-Mobile, and then that can lead to a variety of different problems in utilizing those phones and integrating them with the organization. And now the IT support department is suddenly sort of entangled in using all of these and supporting all of these different technologies. So that's a big risk. And then right now we're still in an era where MDM, mobile device management, it's a combination of appliances, hardware, and software solutions that can do a variety of things for managing mobile devices. Those can be quite expensive. I mean, I think, especially for smaller organizations, putting in a full-fledged mobile device management solution is still fairly expensive at this time. And so, that can become more of a risk. On the personal side, the stipend may not cover the full cost or any cost at all. And this kind of goes back to the morale issue. So, we saw that the personal legal risks are your device might get confiscated in a legal proceeding. The information security risk is your device might get wiped by the IT department if there's concerns about information compromise. And on the financial risks, you may have been getting a device from your organization. They may have been paying for the plan, and now they're moving to BYOD, and now you have to pay for everything. So all of these personal risks really, in many ways, kind of boil down to, morale. They can have an impact on the morale of the staff. So that's one sort of financial risk. And then also, individuals can be held responsible for supporting their own devices. So the organization can say, you know what, we're not really interested in, it's your device, you're responsible for supporting it. You have to go to the Sprint store or the Apple store to get it supported. So we have a couple more polls here that we wanted to ask you about, and we're just curious, for mobile devices, so this is tablets and smartphones, what does your organization provide? What approach is being taken right now? All right, I would say about half of the organizations are not provide neither a device nor a stipend. Maybe a third are providing a device, and about 10% are providing a stipend, and 10% provide both a stipend and a device. That's interesting. That's an interesting result. And then we also wanted to ask that same question with regards to laptops or workstations, which is something that in the past, organizations almost always provided the device, but we've seen that change in recent years as well. Yeah, and that still seems to be the case. Most organizations provide their employees with the equipment they need to do their work. Well, by equipment, I mean the workstations and laptops that they need to do their work. Great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and proceed with the presentation just to get through everything, and then I'll do my best to answer the questions at the end. So, you've got the benefits and you've got the risks, and your job really is to weigh one against the other. And it's not, this smart art, unfortunately, is a little bit simplistic. It's not a scale, and if the benefits outweigh the risks, you suddenly go whole hog on your BYOD. It's much more nuanced than that, and you really need to kind of look at your particular organization and the specific types of security, legal, and financial risks that you might face in going with BYOD, and what benefits you're hoping to get from going with BYOD. And I've got a worksheet here I'm going to show you in just a second that'll give you a tool that you can kind of go through the different risks and benefits. One thing I wanted to say, though, is that don't look at it, oh man, typo, whoops, on size fits all. It should say one size fits all. Don't look at it as a one size fits all solution. And one of the great examples of this is Dell. You know, Dell put in place a BYOD policy that's different for different employees of the company. So they told their sales staff, guess what? You know, we're gonna pay for your tablet if you want to use the tablet. Their sales staff traveled a lot, and it was just much easier for them to use a tablet, and they ended up deploying a system that was very tablet-friendly that allowed them to keep track of all their sales information. So that was the BYOD policy for that group. Whereas for the accounting group, they said, look, most of the work that you do is with our accounting app, and the accounting software needs to run on a Windows workstation. So, we'll be providing you that in your office, and you need to, you really don't need a mobile device, and we won't be providing you with one. And then the executive staff, had their own policy around mobile devices. So in terms of putting together a BYOD plan, I would recommend that you do the following. First, you want to identify the benefits and prioritize those for your organization, and then establish your strategy. What are you hoping to accomplish with BYOD? You also want to look at the risks, and risk is, traditionally thought of as the multiplier of impact times likelihood. So what would be the impact of something bad happening, and how likely is that to happen? And those two factors taken together give you a sense of the overall risk of something. And then once you've established the benefits and the risks, it'll give you a sense of where you want to go with your BYOD policy, and then you could start to look at any solutions that might help you with that. And I would recommend summarizing all of this in a one-page policy. It really doesn't need to be fancy. So a worksheet like the kind I'm showing right now could be helpful in doing the risk-benefit analysis and starting to come up with a BYOD policy. So in this example, I've basically divided up this fictional organization into 3 groups. You've got your program staff who are doing programmatic work for the organization. You've got your development staff who are doing fundraising primarily, and the executive leadership of the organization. So looking at the benefits, this organization said, well, we really need to reduce costs with our program staff. That's what we're hoping to accomplish there by going with the BYOD. And we want to make sure that they're more available. We really need them to be available to the organization more often than just 9 to 5 because of the types of work that we do. The type of information that the program staff access, we're not too concerned about that information getting out. They're basically entering metrics into our outcomes measurement system, and we report on that. We don't want to be careless with it, but it's not something that we're too concerned about. There's very little chance of them being involved in any lawsuits, and there's a financial risk associated with having to support lots of devices for them. So the conclusion there is we're going to, the organization will provide a small stipend for those staff and provide them with limited access to information. They could even say, we don't really need them to have email. They just need to be able to enter data, into our outcomes measurement system. And so we're not going to allow them to check their email from a mobile device. We'll just give them access to that outcomes measurement system. Again, this is all hypothetical, and you'll need to fine-tune this to match the needs of your organization. The development staff, on the other hand, we're looking at BYOD for them because of work flexibility. Most of our development staff, they need the ability to leave work early for family reasons, but they want to do some work at night. They need the ability to work on the weekend. Beyond that, we're not really, there's not many other benefits we're hoping to get there. The type of data that the development staff work with is needs to be very secured. We're talking about donor data, and we can't just have that on, the iPad that their children play with, for example. There's not much chance of any sort of legal risk with them, but there's, possible financial risks of, do we have to set them up with their own computer at home? So, the conclusion from that risk-benefit analysis might be, all right, with the development staff, we're going to provide them with some highly secured access to the development system from home so that they can work from home if they want, but it's not going to be mobile. And, there are ways that you can lock down the connection based on, where their home is and how they're working from home. And then finally, with the executive staff, and this is probably a little bit more typical, they're probably going to say, well, look, we need to be able to work all the time. We need to be available all the time. And, whether it's true or not, I think the general, in this organization, let's say it was true, that their executive staff were really used to using their computers. The ED had an iPhone or a BlackBerry that they loved and had an old Windows XP laptop that they just knew how to use really well, and that's what they wanted to use to do their work. So user adoption was a benefit of having a BYOD policy for the executive staff in this case. Now, the executives have access to a lot of information in the organization, so we need to be worried about security. If any legal action is going to be taken, it'll probably be, the executives will probably be involved in that, so we need to worry about that. We're not as worried about the financial costs. There are only the financial risks. There are only a few executives, and if we need to put more money into supporting them, we're willing to do so. So then the policy there would be, all right, the organization is going to provide the kind of device that the executive wants to use. It's going to be fully managed by the IT department in order to prevent, security risks, or in order to mitigate security risks. But then we'll also have, they'll have access to more information. So this is just an example of how you can kind of start to sketch out where your organization falls in terms of risks and benefits with BYOD, and how you can kind of put together a policy that sort of is tuned to the specific needs of the organization. By way of sort of generic guidelines, this is something that we find is generally, now that I've gotten done telling you that you need to fine-tune it to your organization, I did want to provide you with some good, standards that most organizations will probably want to adopt with their BYOD. Like I said, these dollar figures are rule of thumb. It's kind of what we've seen: $80 a month for executive staff, $50 a month for senior staff, $30 a month for line staff. Requiring a PIN code on a device is definitely something that any BYOD policy should do from a technical standpoint. The technology for doing this kind of varies, so that may be more aspirational for now than realistic. You want to include BYOD as part of your IT acceptable use policy, and you want to be clear about the degree to which IT support is responsible for supporting personal devices. So really quickly, I think we'll have time for about 10 minutes of questions. But before we get to that, I wanted to peer into the future. So, it's 2013. We've been talking about BYOD. That's a good place for us to be. But there's kind of a new trend emerging, really, in this whole debate that sort of sets BYOD off to the side. So I think everything we've talked about today is useful. I think, every organization I've ever worked with could certainly stand to spend a little bit more time thinking about their BYOD policy. It's an important policy to have in place. But I also think we're seeing a shift towards, what's being called mobile first. And mobile first is sort of something that's kind of replacing BYOD. And this is really, kind of the approach that Shell took, where you just kind of assume that in 5, 10 years from now, most employees, most information, workers are going to have their own devices that they're going to want to use. And the goal of the IT department is really going to turn into being one around how do we make sure that, our information is securely accessible from a wide variety of devices and not really worry about, BYOD anymore. I don't think we're there yet, but I think this seems to be the direction that the industry is going. And kind of the key concept around this is authentication. So this picture is the original vault lock and 2 keys from the National German-American Bank in St. Paul, Minnesota. And this bank was founded in 1885. And basically, in order to get to any of the financial assets in the bank, you need to have these 2 keys, and it was a big process to open the door and get into the financial assets inside. And essentially, all of IT management is about securing the information assets of an organization. And it's a much more difficult task in 2013 to secure information assets which can spread freely across a variety of networks than it was to secure financial assets back in 1885. But that's essentially the main problem that all of this, technically at least, points back to. And I think the solutions aren't there yet, but a lot of things are emerging, like single sign-on, different forms of secure cloud-based authentication that are really going to become more important, I think, over the next 2 to 3 years as organizations of all sizes, nonprofit organizations, businesses, look to deal with this quote-unquote BYOD problem. So let's go ahead and take a few questions, and then we have actually, before we do that, if any of you need to get off the line a little bit early, we did want to plug Mobile Citizen. Mobile Citizen is a nonprofit organization that is basically providing low-cost mobile hotspot 4G access to nonprofits. We met them at the N10 conference, and our Chief Technology Officer, Matt Eshelman, sat down with them a couple weeks ago and kind of vetted them a little bit. And it is a really good deal. For $10 a month, you basically get unlimited WiMAX 4G, which is what Clear uses, if those of you out there are familiar with Clear. So we encourage you to check it out. We don't have a horse in this race. We're not a referral partner, and you don't need to tell them that City Community IT sent you. But just if you're interested, if your organization needs mobile access, they're definitely worth checking out. They're reputable, and we're testing some of their hotspots right now. So mobilecitizen.org. We also have another webinar coming up on the 25th next month. We really enjoyed these webinar series, and IT security best practices is definitely an important topic, and it'll be a change of pace. It won't be me or Matt. It'll be Steve Longenecker, our project manager, and Mark Kramer, one of our network administrators, presenting on IT security best practices. So feel free to connect with us online, and now we're going to take a few questions. All right. Do you mind reading those to me, Mercy? That'd be great.
So we got a question from Josh Edgar. He said, when referring to stipends costing more than a single corporate plan, are you referring to reimbursing employees for their internet access versus the cost of just a single internet subscription used by the whole company or organization?
In that case, I was referring more to kind of cellular phone plans and mobile data plans. What we do here at Community IT is we just have a tech stipend, and we tell our staff, well, this is your tech stipend, and you can spend it however you want. If you want to spend it on your mobile phone, you can do that. If you want to spend it on hardware, you can do that on your internet access at home. So we have kind of we sort of identify what we think our employees need in order to do their work, and then provide a stipend for that.
Okay, and then we have another question from Wasim. Says, can you please talk about the future of BYOD with the introduction of VDI? We'll need a BYOD by then?
Yes, so VDI refers to Virtual Desktop Infrastructure. It's also been called Desktop as a Service, DAAS. And what that refers to is that you'll log into your desktop remotely. So if any of you have used Terminal Server or Remote Web Workplace, it's the same concept, where you basically open up a terminal window on your machine, and it connects you to virtual desktop infrastructure. So VDI is definitely a is emerging, continuing to merge, and that sort of gets to what I was talking about in terms of authentication. So going back to, I'm just going to hop back here. VDI would be a great solution in this case for the development group, where they're maybe using Razor's Edge or Sage, fundraising, and that's hosted on a VDI. And when they're at work, they connect to it remotely. When they're at home, they connect to it remotely. They can use it from anywhere, but all the information is contained within the VDI. And once they disconnect from it, there's no risk that any of the data is going to be leaking out onto their personal devices. So I think, VDI is great for, for applications that you really need a desktop to use. I wouldn't, VDI is not a good solution for tablets, for example. And if you can come up with like an app solution or a web-based solution for collecting data, for staff who all they're doing is collecting data, a tablet might work better, in that case.
Okay, and here are two related questions. One from Mark Kramer. Any thoughts on what happens with a personal laptop when a user is terminated? With phones and tablets, they can be wiped, but that's not really possible with full-scale computers. Yep. And a related question from Wasim is there a difference between mobile device policy and workstation laptop policy?
I think increasingly there probably isn't. I do think that those two questions together raise some really important issues. All of the MDM, mobile device management solutions are really geared towards tablets, Android devices and iOS devices. Probably not going to be as effective with someone's personal laptop. So if you have someone who's got, Dropbox gets a bad rap, and typically people would say, well, you don't want Dropbox on the work computer because then they're putting all their work files there and it gets synced to their home computer. But that's the same thing that people were doing, 8 years ago with a thumb drive, where you just copy all of your work documents onto your thumb drive. And so I think, the risk is the same. Mobile device management isn't going to help a whole lot. And in those cases, you really need, that's where the policy comes into place, where you need to identify, well, which documents on our network just cannot get out under any circumstances. So, maybe you're working on a proposal for a grant. Well, maybe you're not as, it's more important for the person who's putting that proposal together to be able to work on it at home on the weekends at the cafe. That's the benefit of that work flexibility is greater than concerns about that proposal staying on their, laptop. Whereas the spreadsheet that has all the salary information for the organization, you may be so concerned about that information getting out that, you just don't allow it to happen. And so, again, it kind of needs to start with the policy and looking at the different types of information that you have, and then setting up a security policy that sort of matches that type of information.
Okay, and here's a question from Josh. He asked, I'm currently trying to evaluate antivirus solutions based on how prevalent BYOD is in our firm. What can you say as for selecting good antivirus that you can share as for applying in a BYOD environment?
That's another great question. So I think the antivirus on non-Windows devices is in the state of catch-up right now. And, you can go to the App Store, you can go to the Android Play Store and find Symantec has a product that you can download and install. Lookout is a really popular one that will kind of check your mobile device for antivirus. My personal feeling is that these are going to that's rapidly becoming table stakes, and most reputable enterprise management antivirus solutions are going to have that component soon if they don't already. So the other thing I would add is that I think we're still living in an era in which Windows viruses are by far the biggest risk to an organization, and Macintosh viruses with OS X, certainly iOS viruses are not a huge risk at all. And there's a lot of concern about malware in the Android ecosystem, and most of that is a result of people going to third-party app stores, and downloading pirated software. So for that reason, Android, presents a bigger risk. But if you can, there's some ways in which you can kind of prevent employees from installing software on their own. And if you do that, then the risk is pretty low at that point. So I would stay focused on what do you need the antivirus software to do to keep your Windows machines managed properly. And then if you get mobile device management with that system, that's a bonus. But I wouldn't make that the driver in that decision. But like I said, I think most of the antivirus systems I'm aware of have it on their roadmap if they haven't rolled it out already. I do think one of the things that you should be looking at with antivirus software is some sort of cloud-based approach to keeping it monitored and the definitions up to date. So 5 or 6 years ago, enterprise antivirus involved having a server on your network that all of the machines checked in with. And that's totally impractical now. So you want to make sure that you have an antivirus system where, at the very least, if it's a server on your network that's acting as the centralized, virus definition and management, console, that it's accessible from outside the organization by those devices. And we're at the 1 hour mark, but I'm happy to stick around for another 5 or 10 minutes and answer more questions. So if you asked a question and it hasn't been answered yet, go ahead and stay on the line, and I'll be happy to run through the list.
Okay, we have a question here from Katie. I had always thought of single sign-on as a convenience thing, but is it a security best practice? It seems like it would make it easier to get access to many of our accounts by cracking one password.
Yes, that's a big. So the advantage of not having single sign-on is that you have sort of the security through obscurity approach, which is, if you have more systems that are harder to crack into, that can make you more secure. I think the growing advantage of having single sign-on is that you're managing that from a single location. So if you have an employee whose mobile device has been stolen, if you're using single sign-on, you can go to the single sign-on console and either lock the account out or change the password there. Whereas if you're not using single sign-on, then the employee needs to track down all the different systems that they were using to change those passwords. So it's kind of like if your wallet gets stolen and you have one credit card, well, yeah, all your assets are in that credit card, but it's, you call the credit card company right away and cancel it. If you have 10 credit cards, you've got to track all of those different credit cards down. I think the other advantage to single sign-on is that most of them are sort of baking security into the product from the beginning. And so, two-factor authentication is a huge, sort of security advantage where you don't just log in with the username and password, but you get a code on a special device, whether it's your phone or, a dongle. And most single sign-on solutions have two-factor authentication kind of baked in. And so now you've got two-factor authentication, securing access to all of your systems instead of, just Google Apps, which has two-factor authentication, and I guess Twitter just introduced some two-factor authentication. It's not as widespread.
Okay, we have 2 questions from Susan. If an employee brings their device to work and it is stolen, who is responsible? And also, how do you ensure if an employee uses their own computer, the files are transferred back to the server?
Both great questions, and I think the first question really is, my sense is that in general most organizations would say that, if you're bringing your device to work, you're kind of taking it home with you at night. You're sort of personally responsible for its security. If the policy there you could probably just take the policy that the organization already has related to personal property, and what happens if the property is stolen. I think one of the things that a lot of people in the corporate world who work on BYOD have found is that BYOD leads to much greater care for the device than in a non-BYOD setting. That in general, when employees are using their own devices, they take much better care of it. And actually, that's a way of kind of reducing costs. But it's a great question. I think it just kind of depends on the individual organization to craft that policy. And then the other question was around making sure that files get back onto the network, and that's a form of data leakage. I'm really glad you raised that, because data leakage isn't just about data falling into the wrong hands, so to speak, but it's also about critical organizational information just disappearing from the organization's purview and no longer being accessible or available to the organization. And I think that really, that's a great issue, and I think if that's a concern, it's important that the organization look at systems that prevent that problem from happening in the first place. And I think that kind of gets to the heart of a big challenge that we face right now, which is what are the best solutions for file sharing in the cloud, so to speak. I think if you're asking, it kind of goes back to user adoption. If you're asking employees to copy files onto a thumb drive, take it home, work on it, bring it back, copy it back over, it's just a lot of steps. And I think the reality is that, unless you have, good management system in place or your culture really supports that approach, it's just, if you're relying on manual steps, things are going to fall through the cracks. And so you've got to try to find a solution that, basically handles all that synchronization for you automatically. And there are some out there that do. The one that we've really been recommending over the last year or so is called Ignite, and it's sort of a hybrid cloud-based and local network storage-based file sharing solution that, as long as employees are using that system, and it's fairly easy to use, it sort of circumvents that problem.
Okay, and the last two questions we have, one from Marita. Do you have a sample policy for cleaning out a laptop when an employee leaves? And Bruce asks, what about non-staff or volunteers and board members?
Great. Two great questions. So on the first question, that again, I feel like I'm punting on all of these. Depends on the specific, requirements of the organization. But what we generally do is we basically have a 30-day policy. Our standard recommendation is you keep the data around for 30 days if possible. Usually, hopefully, all that information is stored on the file server. Any files that they were using, their email is stored on the email server or the email host. And you keep it around for 30 days. You deactivate the account right away, obviously, change the password, wait 30 days, and then basically you let the supervisor know, look, you've got 30 days to go through this employee's information, get what you need, because at the end of 30 days we're deleting it and we're wiping out the laptop. Now, the time frame there varies. Some organizations, it's 60 days. Some organizations, it's a year. I think a year can be a bit too long. You kind of forget about it after a year. But, that just depends on how the organization works, what works best for the organization. But in general, some sort of time limit where the supervisor has a chance to review and pull the data that they need is the basic approach that we take. And then you should wipe the machine, if at all possible, after the person leaves. And then finally, how does this all apply to non-employed staff? And I think, in some ways you can apply it almost in the same way. I think for contract staff, the expectation these days is that they're providing all of their own equipment, and you're just providing them with access to the information. But in some ways, some of the challenges remain the same. You need to provide them with access that's secure, but you also, are going to have concerns about them keeping copies of data and information. How do you control that? And I think the same lessons that we've talked about as far as doing that with employees apply to contractors and even to board members. Kind of identifying what information do they need access to in order to play their role for the organization, to do their job, or to be an effective board member, and then how do you provide them with that access in a secure way. I think boards especially, I feel like a lot of the organizations that I've been working with recently, most of their iPad usage is happening at the board level. And so that's a situation where organizations need to be maybe even more tablet and mobile device friendly than they are with their staff. I feel like a lot of board members are starting to expect that most of what they need they're going to be able to get on their iPad as opposed to paper, or on their computer. And there are different ways of doing that. There are actually systems that focus on, delivering information to boards that handle a lot of that for you, where you can send the documents out through the system. There's an app that corresponds to that on the device. You can set how long the information is retained on the device. You can set an expiration date. Now, those systems are not cheap, so again, it kind of goes back to weighing all of these different risks. Are you worried about board members keeping information for a long period of time, so much so that you're willing to invest in a system like that? Or is the information security concern not so great that you're okay just sending them the PDF file?
And finally, from Marita, if the machine belongs to the employee purchased with a stipend, then how do you control the wiping of the machine?
Oh yeah, well so then that could be a condition of the stipend. So if that's a concern, and again this goes back to the nature of the information. I think a lot of organizations might say, the web developer, we contracted with a web developer, or we brought someone in-house for a year and a half to help us build a new website. All of the documents that they have on their laptop are, web logos and wireframes. We're not too worried about that. They can do what they want with it. Or, maybe you brought someone in to help you work on a sensitive issue, and you are worried about them keeping that data. Then as part of the stipend agreement, as part of their employee agreement when they sign off, when they start, yes, I've read the policies, you can include a clause that says, we will provide you with the stipend for your device, but at the end of your time here, our IT department will wipe your device clean. So, I mean, it's great. That's a great question, and I think it speaks to the need to kind of think about that ahead of time and make sure that you have the right policy in place, before you go down that road. Because once you're there, it's much harder to deal with it. All right, well, that's it for the questions. Great questions, and I really appreciate everyone's time, and I hope you all enjoyed the webinar. As I mentioned before, there was a blog post on this that had some links. So if you're interested in links to the DropSmack article or links to the Shell case study, just go to our website, communityit.com. Go to the blog. It's the third entry down there, and you can click on that, and you'll find all of the links in there. And we will be sending you a link to these slides so you can download them, and as well as the recording. So thank you all for your time, and I hope you have a great day.